Where were you when? Where were you when? Where were you when? Where were you when, depending on your age, when you heard that JFK had been shot? Do you remember if you remember that? Do you remember where you were and how you heard it? Where were you when you heard that news? Where were you when you heard that someone you loved had died? How did you hear that news? Did it feel real? Where were you? We have heard much in the last week. Where were you on 9/11 as we remember 20 years later of the tragedy that happened on 9/11? I, like you, remember the voice. I was on the road, I was going to seminary, and I was on the road to Cambridge, and I heard the voices of those morning hosts, you know, that their job is to kind of wake us up and make us laugh. And I remember the voices changing. Where were you last March when you realized that the world was shutting down? Remember when it finally became real? I think for most of us it was a process, right? Because this was the United States of America, and there had been things, but people had said to me, you know, Sue, this is dangerous, but it's dangerous. We hear in the gospel message this morning, Jesus reaching that point in his earthly ministry where he's done teaching and preaching and healing. You know, he's just become this charismatic leader enough so they're like, who is he? And he's like, so really, how do you really think this movie's gonna go? Right? Because if this is a well-written movie, right, this movie, the Messiah doesn't get killed. So you think I'm so full of good news? Who do you really think that I am? And they say, maybe a prophet. And Jesus says to them and starts to tell them the news that they can't comprehend any more than I could have comprehended in April that I would be doing Christmas Eve on Zoom from my living room. They could no more comprehend that Jesus was going to be captured, that they weren't going to believe him, and that he was going to be crucified. And his words are so important for us in this time. Because Jesus tells us this when this is written long before this was written, and it's as true today as it was on that day. And we don't want to hear it any more today than they did. That to really believe in God, to really love God and live a life of faith, that we are all going to go through periods of suffering. Every single one of us. That suffering is part of life, I would submit. That it is part of what it means to be human. But as people of faith, what's different for us is we are reminded that we're not alone. That Jesus' lesson to us is that we're not alone, that God is with us. But I'm jumping to the last chapter. And I've said before, I do not understand people that read the last chapter books. Today, we hear Jesus saying, those that will follow God, those that will follow me will undergo great suffering. And just like everything else, Jesus' role, Jesus' job, Jesus' call and vocation was to show us how to do it. And to show us that God would be with us. Well, that doesn't sound like a very promising movie, does it? But it's true, isn't it? We all know this. Those of you that do remember the day you got the news that your president had been shot. Not about whether you liked the president or not, but the president had been shot. We have learned at different times in our history just how vulnerable we really are. We have learned at times, no matter who we are and where we come from and where we live, that we are still, in fact, human. That we are, in fact, vulnerable. That hard things will happen, that our hearts will break. God willing, if you're here this morning, either in person or on Zoom, you have had that experience and found that your way through that with a God, maybe beyond your understanding, maybe in ways you don't understand, maybe in ways that you do have language for. Maybe it's through other people just carrying you through it. But Jesus is there to say, this is the part of the story. This is the part of the story that's going to shift to the hard part. And Peter tells him to shut up. And if you look at this in the Greek, literally, much of the language is stop. We feel that way, don't we, sometimes? We feel that way. No, God, there must be a way. There must be a way. How is it that we maybe look for messiahs in other places? You know, that's what addiction's about. You know, I believe it's a disease, but I also believe we're looking for something outside of ourselves to stop that. Don't make that. Nah. Or maybe I'll just put it off for a little while. How is it that we had those boulders in our way, whatever they are, and we're like, you know what, I kind of like that fence. I'm good. I love God just this much. COVID-19, I think, has really called us to remember yet again how little control we have over so much. But on this weekend, let's go back for a minute to 9/11. 9/11, we remember those times wherever you were, whatever happened. Maybe you knew some, maybe someone, maybe you didn't. But I think it's hard to imagine sometime during that day we didn't realize that we just weren't as safe as we thought we were. That we just were a little more, this didn't happen in the United States. We were used to seeing it in other countries, and as good Episcopalians, and you know, we prayed for others. Oh, the poor country that has violence. This time it was us. And afterwards, I don't know about you, but I think we all can remember how people were just a little nicer to each other, weren't we? People just managed, there was just something in the air. It seemed quiet for a while, but then when we were out and about, I remember, like I said, I was in school, I remember being in Cambridge, just at a Starbucks, and people were, before 9/11, people were just here, hither and there, just, and everybody's like, you know, you want to go ahead of me? The enemy, of course, was outside of us. The enemy was outside of us. And think about that for a minute. Because it's what we do, right, with human behavior. We see it in junior high all the time. My first job was teaching junior high. If you want to find out what dynamics are like, put some junior high girls together in a room, right? And I can tell you, if you've got more than two, you are going to have fights. Just because it's the nature of the beast. And they are going to divide and conquer, and they may switch over time, but they are going to always be mad at the other. We do that, right? Because it's safer. And at least in 9/11, the enemy was from outside of us. So we had a time in our history where we were able to come together because we all agreed. George W. Bush described yesterday in a beautiful and eloquent way what he thought America should look like and what it used to be like and what it was like right afterwards. And it was important because it isn't about politics. But the enemy was from outside after 9/11. COVID-19 got in, and you know those diseases which I know nothing about, have no ability to articulate them with any kind of intelligence. All I know is that it feels like it has a life of its own, and the scientists and doctors are amazing. I don't understand anything about what they do, and I'm in awe of their unrelenting passion for trying to help us find a way forward in health and healing. But our country right now is in such a hard place. We are so broken. We are so broken. We need Jesus' message of suffering. We need to be reminded that this is not the first time in history we have been this broken, but boy, it's my first time living through it and it feels yucky. We are taught, Jesus says, what are we supposed to do? We go back over and over again. You ask Jesus, he goes back to the prophet Micah. What are we called to do? To do justice. And I'm not talking about justice ministry, which is great if you're into it, but I'm talking about justice, like justice. Act justly. Micah said, love faithfully. And walk humbly with God. If you really want to follow God and be in faith, we have to find ways to be able to be in community. But the scariest part about where we are right now is the enemy is lost. I think it's Martin Buber that said, you know, if you look all around, at the end of the day, the enemy, the scariest enemy is the one within us. And this isn't any other country. The enemy is us. And how can we be agents of change? How can we sit here? You know, I preach mostly to the choir, right? I mean, I'm sure some of us have different opinions about stuff, but we treat each other nicely. We get to have different opinions, but we get to do it nicely and with respect. And somehow we need to be agents of that grace beyond our walls. Because COVID-19 has exposed the disparities between all kinds of things. Peter didn't want to hear it. This was fake news, he said. You cannot be right, Jesus. You have listened to the wrong channel. Jesus is like, I'm really sorry for the bad news, buddy, but this is the way it's going to go. That sometimes hard things are going to happen. Sometimes your heart's going to be broken. But it's in those broken places that God is going to fill you up. It is in those broken places that you will be changed. We are changed by our experiences. We must be changed. Because if we aren't changed, what difference does it matter? Yesterday, this week, I've spent time with Sally Thorne and her family, and we remembered Roger. Roger, as many of you know, was a wonderful artist. He was just a wonderful artist, and he had a twinkle in his eye, and he loved to sail, and he had all kinds of, he was just that kind of person. But how I want to bring Roger in today so that we remember is that when Roger was a child, he had polio. And his dominant hand was his right hand. And he ended up, if you ever met him, he ended up not being able to use his right hand. It was easy to not notice it because, of course, with the twinkle in his eye and who he was on the planet, it was easy to not notice. But his dominant hand became unusable. But do you know what he did? He didn't say, "Oh no, I don't want to be an artist." He didn't stop his dream. He didn't stop what he needed to do. He trained himself to use his left hand. And if you ever get the chance to see any of his work, it will make you weep because it's beautiful, but because he trained himself to use his non-dominant hand to do the piece of art that you and I could only dream of doing. I was talking to an art teacher from Dover High School yesterday, and I said to her, you know, kind of like in my theology, it's like Roger was just so full of the Spirit that there was no way that the artist couldn't get out. The artist had to get out. What would it be like for us if our love for Christ just had to get out? That's what being disciples of God is. It's not easy. None of us do it perfectly. Any of you that know me very well know I do it very imperfectly. But we're created that way because God gets to help us out. And so on this day, as we do remember 9/11, I want us to also remember that on 9/11, 2,996 souls died. And we remember it as we should. We remember those firefighters, as a person that has a son that's a fireman. I just weep when I think about those men and women running into the buildings. We give thanks and praise for their ministry. But let us remember that as of today, 660,000 people have died from COVID-19. 660,000 people have died of COVID-19, and those are the ones that are reported. But the enemy's from within. So on this day, as we hear Jesus say, it's the day to pivot. We are called to pivot, to be those instruments that God is calling us to be. To remember that feeling that we felt after 9/11, perhaps, or felt after something else happened that moved us to the point that we knew that God was real and we needed to let it out. That it's not about us. And God will be there for us. I know this is an untypically serious sermon for me, but I feel like it's an untypically serious time. And Jesus is telling us he will be with us, he will walk with us, and we're going to be uncomfortable. But let us remember the words of Micah. We are called to do justice, to embrace faithful love and walk humbly with our God. Where were you when